Life Near the Bone. Written by Billie Sue Mosiman. Performed by Todd Farrell.
Where do you think life's sweetest? Jeff Castaigne stood next to overflowing shelves with a book open in his hands. Where? Deep inside a woman who's stacked like a movie star. Let's say she owns an exercise gym. Yeah, that's where it's sweetest. Jeff's roommate was bent over at the waist, towel drying freshly shampooed hair. It says right here, Jeff said, ignoring Greg's worthless comment, pointing to a page in the book, "It is life near the bone where it is sweetest." I believe that. Near the bone? What's that supposed to mean? Unless it's the pelvic bone he's talking about. He chuckled at his own sexist wit. Henry David Thoreau said this. I don't think he was talking about a woman's anatomy. Still, I don't get it. It's all mumbo-jumbo to me. Greg slung the damp towel over the back of a slouch-backed easy chair and plopped down in it. He hiked up one foot onto the lip of the cushion and began pulling at his toenails, ripping them off in slivers one by one. Jeff moved from the bookcases and lay down on the sofa. He propped the book on his chest so as to block the view of his roommate's disgusting hygiene habits. Filthy man, he thought. I'll have to go behind him and sweep the nails from the carpet and put them in the trash. It's like picking up baby shit. Doesn't he know that? Is Thoreau your philosopher of choice this week? Greg asked. It was obvious by Greg's tone of voice he didn't care about the answer. Jeff almost failed to respond, but then decided he had taken quite enough sarcasm for one night, friend or no friend. I think that's unfair, he said. I don't go around picking philosophies the way someone collects porcelain dogs, or the way you collect those stupid arty-farty posters. Greg paused in the ripping off of a bit of ragged nail from his big toe. He frowned over at the supine Jeff. Low blow. Okay, maybe I'm just being an asshole. Sorry. Quote all the Thoreau you want. What do I care? Oh, thanks for giving your divine permission. Jeff sulked behind Thoreau's Walden and would not say anything else. All during the following day, Jeff read and pondered Thoreau's book. No matter how ringing and clear and intriguing the pages he read, he kept coming back to that one quote, nagging at it, taking it apart and putting it together again, trying to make it solely his property. How does one get near enough to the bone so that life would be sweet? There stood the question, this towering, incomprehensible question that might drive him mad if he let it. For life at this juncture was sour and smelling of decay. A desperate air clung to him, fumed off his clothes no matter how often he changed them. It rolled off him in waves from his pores. He decided that must be the reason the job interviews went badly. They could detect his desperation, maybe smell it the way he did, that fetid stench of rotting peaches left in neglect on a drain board for a month. Not his fault he'd lost his job. Houston had been good for him when he'd first moved there from the moribund Gary, Indiana. These were boom times, and jobs were for the picking, and money flowed faster than a flooding bayou. But feast always gave way to famine, and so it was for the city that boasted itself the jewel of the Southwest. He had clung to his managerial position at the Boston Whaler dealership for as long as he could. Why blame him for a loss of sales and a slumping profit margin? But they did, and he was out, and he was not coming in until he could find a job more rewarding than shoveling burgers out of a Jack-in-the-Box, thank you, Charlie Brown. You wouldn't catch him demeaning himself for minimum wage. He still had. He glanced at his fingers, and from a balled fist flicked out one finger at a time, counting the weeks. 6 weeks before his unemployment check was cut off. He'd find something worthwhile before then, wouldn't he? The possibility that he might never find work again left a little knot of fear tingling in his belly. He began to perspire, to smell himself. Needed a shower. Needed to think. Think about getting to the bone, where life was sweet again, where it wouldn't matter fate had turned, where he might again discover his lost self-respect. Around 3 in the afternoon, Just before Greg came home from work at Bayshore Hospital, Jeff found a clue in Thoreau. It was like encountering an old, long-lost friend, for immediately he remembered part of the quote from high school literature books. Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplify. Simplify. So that's how it's done, Jeff realized. That's how you get down to the pure, gleaming skeleton of existence and find peace. So obvious. He had been trying too hard, running too fast, and complicating his world unnecessarily. Simplify. What are you doing? Isn't it apparent? I'm ridding my life of detail and clutter. Greg turned down the volume on the television where a married couple was sparring on a sitcom. He went to Jeff and stooped near him on the floor by the stereo. What are you going to do with those albums? The dumpster. It's all for the trash, man. But Jeff, you've had some of those albums since we were in college together. Why would you get rid of them now? Some you'll never find again, not in the original. Jeff paused and looked at the cover of an early Jimi Hendrix album. This one had belonged to his older sister. May she find peace in her sumptuous, overcomplicated, frivolous life. He placed it with some care on top of the other albums in a cardboard box. It wasn't worth a weary sigh, really. Just junk. Really, he wouldn't miss it. I don't want them anymore. I've lugged stuff around for years. That's the point, Greg. I'm through with all that. I'm simplifying my life. But... Jeff dumped the rest of the albums into the box and smiled beatifically at his friend before going to the shelves lining the far wall. He turned his back and began pulling out volumes and stacking them in piles on the floor at his feet. Now what are you up to? More clutter. Got to go. Your library! Greg squeaked, coming to his feet. Don't need it. It's just littering the place up. Books are dust catchers. Everything I own does nothing for me but gather dust. Now, Jeff, you know I don't give a good goddamn about books. I wouldn't read one if my life depended on it. But you read all the time. If you throw all these books out, what are you going to read? Jeff just said one word. Thoreau. And continued hauling the bound titles from the shelves to stacks on the floor. Greg grabbed up Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and held it to his chest. Jeff, I don't understand any of this. You love books. You're a glutton for books. How can you give them up this way? And your music. I don't know what this means. Jeff turned, all in a rush. He flourished 2 thick books by Dostoevsky in front of Greg's face. Garbage! Greg, startled, backed immediately out of range. Can't you get it? Haven't you been listening to me? Sudden rage spiraled upward like a tornado swirling between the two friends. Thoreau says that luxuries and comforts of life are not indispensable. They're hindrances to the elevation of mankind. Can't you see that? Are you blind as well as deaf? Are you a total fucking mindless vegetable? Greg carefully replaced the Miller book on top of one of the stacks and slunk away to the far side of the living room, where he took up a watchful pose in the easy chair. He began to chew his fingernails to still the quake inside his chest. It didn't seem to bring an instant of relief. Greg stumbled home from a double shift at the hospital, so tired even his eyeballs ached. He saw that his framed posters had disappeared from the wall behind the television set. At any other time this would have served to make him go into a rant, but he was too tired to do more than search for Jeff and ask for an explanation. He would put in a mild protest and retrieve the posters, hang them again. At Jeff's bedroom door he paused on the threshold. Jeff stood emptying his chest of drawers into a Glad trash bag. While his back was to the door, Greg glanced quickly around. The Navajo rug his friend had bought on a visit to Santa Fe had been rolled in a corner. The covers on the bed were missing, except for one rumpled sheet and a bare pillow. The lampshade, crumpled on the floor, looked stomped. This frightened Greg more than any of the other evidence that his friend was losing it. Greg couldn't guess the import of the shade unless Jeff meant to live in the unprotected glare of a light bulb. This was decidedly going too far. He must intervene the way they taught at the hospital outpatient alcohol clinics. Sometimes people had to intervene and risk getting their asses kicked if they saw someone they loved descending into perilous territory. Now Jeff was methodically discarding clothes. Would he go naked? Jeff finally chose to keep 2 rather than 3 pairs of jockey shorts. All he needed was a change while one was washed and drying. He bundled up the rest of the underwear into his arms, ready to stuff it all into the rapidly filling bag. He saw Greg in the door. "Hey there, you know what? I've been thinking about you pulling those double shifts. It's crazy, man. It's unenlightened. I told you what Thoreau said about luxuries and comforts. Wanting things is a trap. Once inside the trap, you never get free. The jaws lock down tight. Here you are working 16 hours straight so you can afford that Camaro you just bought, and those nights on the town with your girl, and... Jeff? Yeah?" He tamped down the clothes in the Glad bag, grinning all the while. "What did you do with my posters?" "Oh, those. I put them in your room. You really should think about doing away with that kind of stuff. It just drags you down. Drags you down." "Jeff, I think it's time you saw someone. Dr. Bronsky over at Bayshore is pretty good. I'll get him to give you a professional discount, and—" "Fuck you!" Vehement. Aggressive. Even Jeff's good-natured temper was rapidly vanishing. "Come on, Jeff, I'm serious. This is getting way out of hand. Look at you. You're throwing away your clothes, for Christ's sakes." "Not everything. I'm keeping 2 pairs of jeans and 2 shirts. That's all I need. What do I need all these clothes for? For starters, maybe you'd need them for a job? For going to interviews to get a job?" "Go away." Jeff turned his back, pulled out the bottom drawer of his chest, and hauled out folded summer shorts and sports shirts. "I can't, Jeff. I have to try to do something." Jeff halted in his pawing through the drawer. He said quietly, "If you don't go away right now, I won't be responsible for what happens." "Are you threatening me now?" "I hear a different drummer, Greg. If you don't hear it, fine, but don't interfere. Now go away." Jeff didn't want to go, but he didn't want to stay either. He waited only until his friend turned slowly, ominously, and he saw the look of a nervous zealot, the mad, staring look of a monk holding a flame, ready to immolate himself with the cleansing holy fire. Then he knew he must leave. There was nothing he could do. Jeff had ventured too far over the edge, and he was falling without a net. He had to call from the living room, too fearful to tell Jeff anything to his face ever again. "I'm moving out, Jeff." He waited. "Do you hear me? I'm going to pack my shit and I'm out of here. You're sick, Jeff. I'm not staying with you any longer when you won't listen to me, when you won't go for help. You're dangerous. Don't you realize that? You've been throwing away stuff for a week." "Fuck you," he heard Jeff call back furiously. "Fuck you and the Gucci, Rolex, BMW, Beverly Hills horse you rode in on. I don't need you around anyway. You're nothing but a prostitute. You sold out the day you were born." Jeff Castaigne gradually came to enjoy life again. It seemed as if he had been on a quest for the Grail and found it embedded in the pure, clean stone of Thoreau's noble philosophy. He had been walking through trash, stumbling, lost, and now he could see the path before him. He read, "Some circumstantial evidence is very strong, as when you find a trout in the milk." From this he deduced that Greg's leaving was ordained. It helped him unearth order in a disorderly universe. He had never loved him or anything, not truly. They were just friends for a while, and who turned out to be a traitor to all that was good and right and just? So what if he proved to be the asshole of the world, the turncoat, the Philistine? The apartment was shaping up, looking good. He rubbed his palms together in contentment. In the living room he'd gotten rid of everything but one kitchen straight-backed chair, an unadorned fruit crate from the Safeway, and his precious copy of Walden. In the kitchen he'd thrown out everything but one plate, one knife, one pan. He ate from cans mostly, so what was the point of owning dinnerware and drawers full of silverware and cabinets full of cooking utensils? He saw his landlady scuttle to the dumpster and take the electric grill and the popcorn popper. Crazy old bitch. Frivolous, frowsy pack rat. His bedroom was a spare cell now, and he loved it. It was a hell of a chore to lug the bed from the apartment down the stairs and out back to the dumpster, but, sweating and swearing, he'd managed. The floor was immensely more comfortable after a few nights. He hardly ached at all anymore when he woke. He thought the Spartan idea converged well with Thoreau's philosophy, so he incorporated it into his new life modality. He had the phone company disconnect his telephone at week's end. Greg kept calling, and the job agencies too. What a fucking nuisance. What a bore. He didn't need a job. His needs were too few to demand a real income. When the unemployment check ran out, he'd apply for welfare. If they wouldn't let him have it, he'd go on the streets. It meant nothing to him one way or the other. Thoreau said, "I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude." Jeff embraced that to mean he must let the world flow past. In the apartment, on the street, wherever he found himself, it didn't matter. He carried solitude with him like an envelope in his pocket, and no one could divest him of it ever again. They didn't even know he had it. He patted his shirt pocket as if solitude really was a thing of dimension and weight, and it belonged to him alone. It was not until a month later that Jeff found the quote that would change his life and get him down to the nub of existence. He'd still been searching for the place next to the bone, scraping and scraping away society's frills until he could feel the knife screeching somewhere far off in the dim nether reaches of the fog that had come to surround his days. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, to one who is striking at the root. That is what he came upon in his diligent study, and when he found it, he knew then he was nearly home free through the twilight of his ignorance. He heard clarion bells ringing on the reading aloud of that sentence. He shivered with anticipation at the coming understanding that crept forth from the dark corner shadows of his barren apartment. That understanding, when it took him, would rend the foundations of his misery and bring him down to the bone, down past the slime and corruption, the gate of flesh that barred the way. "Hello, Mrs. Whipshaw." "Jeff, how nice of you to visit. Won't you come in?" The old woman who had nabbed the grill and the popcorn popper from the trash dumpster let her tenant inside the dank, bird-shit-splattered living room. A white cockatiel flew through the air in protest, wings flapping wildly. "Pay no attention to Potto. He's a spoiled brat and isn't used to polite company. Hush, Potto. Behave now." Jeff declined to sit in the newspaper-covered chintz chair Mrs. Whipshaw gestured he take. He stood with his hands behind his back, smiling the stiff smile of the Buddha, the smile of the inscrutable. His gaze flicked around the room, and soon his smile evaporated, replaced by a sneer of disgust. White smears of Potto's crap covered the drapes, dripped down the neck of a brass table lamp, lay in dried, yellow-streaked plops on top of the furniture. It looked as if an insane painter had come and, in a frenzy, swung a wet brush around and around to create a barbarous nightmare of interior decoration. "I haven't seen you out of your apartment in ever so long," Mrs. Whipshaw said, shooing the contentious bird from her shoulder. Jeff watched the cockatiel closely to see where it might light down. It hung upside down from the silent, dust-layered ceiling fan and screeched at him, one eye cocked in his direction. "I haven't been out much," Jeff said, once reassured the bird was not coming to him. He felt a nausea rising and had to swallow bitter gorge. It tasted of the kidney beans he'd consumed the night before. Sickening, eating, an odious habit, made people into worms. Scoop it in, shit it out, round and round she goes, where she stops no one knows. "What happened to your nice friend, that Greg boy?" Did he really move out? Posters, Jeff said by way of explanation. What's that, dear? Jeff crossed the room, his eye trained on the bird as he came for Mrs. Whipshaw, with the one knife he'd saved for cutting through meat. Disposing of the bodies. Now, Thoreau never gave advice about that sort of thing. Damn odd. He knew about everything else. You'd think the man would have left some sort of roadmap. Jeff had to ponder the situation for 2 days before he could decide what to do. He had Mrs. Whipshaw in Potto cooling in the huge freezer she kept, strangely enough, in the spare bedroom of her ground-floor apartment. He had the occupant of the other downstairs apartment, punky-looking George with the orange and green blotch in his hair, stuffed over double at the waist in his broom closet. Cluttered, cluttered. Baseball mitts, bats, skates, pool cues, bowling balls, smelly running shoes. Much too cluttered for anyone sane. He had James, the quiet law student, in the bathtub in the apartment on the second floor. He sat shriveling like an old potato with a radio in his lap. Pity it wasn't a law manual, though what good that would do him now, Jeff couldn't guess. He had the Danju sisters waiting in their beds. Nice girls, not a bother in the world, but the way they lived, unbelievable. Frozen dinner trays growing mold, magazines littering the carpet, thready dust balls and trailing spider webs and filmy bikini panties hanging everywhere. It was enough litter to turn the stomach. It took Jeff all night just to get their apartment under some kind of control. He cursed them with every name in the book, nice girls or not. Anyone living like a pig needed to be called a swine. Old Man Shore was no trouble at all. He was all bent and crippled by arthritis. He couldn't run. He couldn't even crawl, not toward the last. Cried, though. Cried like a fucking baby. And him, old as the hills, didn't make proper good sense to Jeff, but there it was. A man who chose to live with a cat that scratched out shitball litter every time it used the box had to be some kind of nut to begin with. Everyone knew you could get terminal diseases from cats. Jeff had saved Shore a prolonged and no doubt much more painful death. Now to dispose of the bodies, without Thoreau's help, without his wisdom and guidance, and to return the apartment house, the entire building, to neat, impersonal harmony. It would take boxes and boxes of Glad trash bags, dozens of cardboard boxes from the Safeway, a wheelbarrow. Yes, he would need a wheelbarrow. He hoped the dumpster wasn't full tonight. He would be taking numerous loads to it. His heart sang with freedom. He was at last seeing the very edge of the pristine bone, a flicker of purity, and it was a glorious glimpse of paradise, heaven itself. He heard the pounding of feet coming up the stairs before he ever heard knocking on the door. He was tired, sweaty, needed a shower, cold and long. He peeked through the viewer and saw the intruder into his place of calm and peace was the treasonous poster man, Greg. Figured. "Jeff?" Greg called, his face pressed against the door. "Let me in." Jeff unbolted the lock and swung wide the door, turning away and walking across the room as he did so. "Jeff?" There was a pregnant pause. Then, "What the hell? What did you do with all the furniture? Jesus!" Jeff wore only a pair of grimy shorts. His hair stuck out on end as he'd been sleeping and not washing. He was covered with dirt and smudges that looked like tar or oil. "What do you want now?" "I've been worried about you. I tried to call, but the operator told me the phone was disconnected." "So?" "Well, how are you?" "What do you care? You vamoosed for a decadent lifestyle, didn't you? You want to be featured on The Rich and Famous one day, don't you? So why would you care?" Greg cleared his throat. He looked like a weasel caught in a hole. The criticism, however exaggerated, was a little too close to home. Did you find work?" Jeff chortled unpleasantly. "Go away, Greg. I have nothing to say to you." He left the room and disappeared into the darkened hallway. Greg followed close behind. Jeff, wait. I really mean it. I'm still worried. How are you paying the rent? Are you eating? I could help, you know. I haven't really abandoned you. No rent. Mrs. Whipshaw said so. Dear old lady, dear bird lady. Jeff went directly into the hall bath and stepped in the tub. He slipped out of his shorts and threw them on the floor. He turned on the shower, drew the curtain. No rent. Rent-free, Jeff said above the roar of the water. Ask her yourself. Maybe I will. The shower curtain snapped open and droplets of water flew in the air, spotting Greg's face. No, you won't. Don't you dare. You stay out of my business affairs. You're no longer in my life, remember? You wanted your fucking posters and your soft cushions and your steak and potatoes. Remember? Jeff, can't you talk with me without fighting? Can't you see your way clear to be reasonable? Jeff shut the curtain. He sudsed down his body and scrubbed himself hard with the washcloth. Finally, he said, in as sane and sensible a tone as he could muster, Let me through, and I'll take you on a tour of my new orderly world. Full of misgivings, Greg lowered the toilet seat and sat down to wait. This time he had to do something before he left. This time it was absolutely imperative he not leave Jeff alone with his warped delusions. He had known him too long not to try to help. Jeff finished bathing, dried, dressed himself quickly in jeans and a shirt and sneakers. I've seen the place, Jeff. You got rid of everything. It looks like a prison. Not a prison. A sanctuary. A man has to begin at home. Then, he glanced slyly at Greg, he branches out. I don't think you're going to find very many followers. Not many people want to join a cult that denies all possession. Greg laughed easily, but soon quieted when Jeff walked past him to the front door. Come on, I want to show you how I've hacked at the chaos and brought it under supervision. I want to show you what can be done when you simplify your life, when all the extraneous is ruthlessly cut away down to the very roots where the trouble lies. Jeff took his friend to Mrs. Whipshaw's freezer first thing. They walked together through the scrupulously cleaned, empty apartment to the spare room. When the stunned, horrified remonstration began, it was a beast of a battle to get Greg subdued enough to shut his mouth. To shut his mouth forever. Less than a week passed after Greg's visit before Jeff wandered through the silenced apartment house in the middle of the night, saying goodbye to his perfectly balanced world. People had come to inquire. Mrs. Whipshaw's son screamed that he'd be back with the police. He would see his mother, goddammit, if he had to bring the National Guard to do it. She never would have left town without telling him, he claimed from the bottom of the apartment steps. Don't tell him she would. The boyfriend of one of the Danju sisters left without a squawk, but as he went to his car, he kept squinting suspiciously over his shoulder. 2 law students stopped by to ask why their friend had not been to classes. Sick? They hadn't heard from him. Too sick to call them? Contagious. Wasn't that funny, though? He always seemed in such good health. Yes, it was time to go, as much as he hated to. He had invested a ridiculous amount of time in creating order, in simplifying the complex. It was a shame, terribly unjust, that he must flee what was an almost perfect creation. Yet, an apartment house in the center of a seedy district inside of an abhorrently chaotic big city was no real place for him anyway. He needed his own Walden Pond. He needed to escape to the wilds, sequester himself away from the mad, chattering, bruising world. With the money Greg and the apartment dwellers had on persons or in their possession, Jeff took a bus from Houston to the dry West Texas town of Midland. Once there, he hired a taxi driver to take him into the desert. Where? Where no one lives, Jeff said, waving money in the man's face. Are you nuts? How are you going to get back? No phone there, buddy. Nothing but snakes and tumbleweeds, sand and cactus. You can't go out there. A friend's meeting me later in his car, if it's any of your business. I'll come back with him. Now, will you drive? He drove for 2 hours, blabbering all the way, bitching about the heat, the absurdity of this, the kooks he ran into. What a job. Jeff ignored him in favor of a reading for the dozenth time from Walden. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew where the bone glistened most cleanly. It was not in the woods where Thoreau had hidden away himself. It was not in the mountains where shady, towering presences safeguarded the timorous. It was not in the lush valleys where nature rioted and the senses were overwhelmed. It was in the plain, open desert, the place man had not yet desecrated with his two-bit palaces and his glittering signs and his bubbling, stinking tarmac laid end to end forever and amen. It was here in the steaming heart of untrodden, forgotten land that Jeff Castaigne knew he would find the ultimate simplification. He wanted that more than breath itself.
This buddy of yours don't show up in time? You could have a sunstroke out here without water. I tell you, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen, the cabbie complained. I don't like it, none a bit. I ain't gonna be responsible for you dying out here, you know. 105 in the shade, if there was any shade. I've been trying to talk you out of this, ain't that right?
Jeff failed to answer, except to say, "Pull over here. This is where I get out." Even before the taxi made a U-turn on the infrequently traveled two-lane highway, Jeff was already heading off across the hard-packed sands. He moved west toward the lowering sun, Thoreau's book clutched tightly in hand. Heat mirages blinked on and off in the distance like defective pale blue neon tubes. A lone vulture rode the high currents, a dot in the scalding blue sky. Here was soul. Here was where eternity sat down to shake hands with creatures courageous enough to come unfettered. Jeff Castaigne looked back only once to make certain he was losing sight of the long black strip of highway, to make sure he was leaving civilization behind. He thought now it had never belonged to him. That world was under rule of someone else, someone other, alien. He lost all sense of time when day segued into night, into day, into night. He stumbled and dropped the book, picked it up, surprised to see his hands blistered black, but never mind, never mind. Finally his tongue swelled in his mouth and hung over his cracked lips like a fat gray slug. His lungs, a fiery bellows, labored to keep him going. His eyes had swollen to slits, blocking the blood-red disk of the sun. His skin, his clothes at some past time discarded, seeped clear fluid from pustules that he split apart with pinched fingers. Each passing second he could feel the loosening of the hold the world had on the flesh. He was a dragon whose scales fell clattering at his feet. Each faltering, dragging step he managed to take brought him ever nearer the crux of reality, ever closer to the bone. He yearned. He begged. He prayed. In the end, he raged.
"Didn't I sacrifice enough?"
he yelled across the endless sand.
"Didn't I scrape past all the filth?"
He pulled on a sack of skin until he tore off pieces and had ripped an ear from his skull. He went to his knees and screamed soundlessly. At last he could hear a velvety voice hissing across the still air as it approached. He was almost home, it said. He bowed his head in relief and wept bloody tears. "Come," it said. "Nearer," it said. "Where life is simple, life is true. Where no one knows you, no one cares, and nothing can get you back again. Come now, where you belong," it said. "Ever closer. Come with me, where life is sweetest, near the bone, near the white, white